Hi, my name is Felix Matos Rodriguez, and I am the Chancellor of the City University of New York. People who know me call me Felo, and this is my new conversation space on CUNY TV, Café con Felo. Bienvenidos a Café con Felo. Today we have the privilege of hosting Dr. Mark Hauber, a leading scientist and the Executive Director of CUNY's Advanced Science Research Center, known as the ASRC. His work shows us why science is not just important, it's essential for building a better future, deepen our connection to the natural world, and to preserve the health of our planet for all of us. The Advanced Science Research Center recently celebrated its 10th anniversary as a place where big ideas come to life. It is a hub for innovation, tackling challenges that impact all of us, from creating new ways to protect our environment to developing technologies that make our lives better. Under Dr. Hauber's leadership, the center has become a powerhouse that puts CUNY on the map as a global leader in scientific innovation. His work isn't just about science on a grand scale. It is also about the beauty of the natural world, including his fascinating research on birds. Recognized as a National Geographic Explorer, his discoveries help us understand how these amazing creatures think and adapt. It's a perfect example of how science can bring together the global and the personal, showing us that the biggest questions of our time often begin with small, careful observations. So grab your cafe, settle in, and join us for a conversation about the power of discovery and mentoring the next generation of scientists. But before we begin, Mark, are you a coffee drinker? And if you do, how do you take your coffee?
I like my coffee. I like mochas, but my regular coffee is with milk, no sugar.
For the long days of the lab.
Yes, exactly.
But we're so happy to have you here. We celebrated the 10th anniversary of the ASRC. We'll be talking about that in a second. But I think it'd be really, really important to the public here to get a sense as to how did you become a scientist? How did you become interested in birds, and a little bit about your own journey as a scientist?
Thank you so much. I am a terrible role model, I have to admit, because I always wanted to study birds. Ever since I was 5 years old, I dragged my mother to watch migratory birds, to watch stork's nest inside of our balcony. And so I always knew I wanted to study birds. I can't tell you what moment it came to me, but I managed to do it for my undergrad and my graduate school and my faculty life as a researcher too. I grew up in Hungary, and so these are all European birds I got to know. And so when I moved to the US for my undergrad, I had to learn a brand new set of birds and also exchange my Russian binoculars to, some Zeiss binoculars, which was a nice change to see the birds better.
What was it about birds that you thought could have implications for larger questions in science or for other kinds of discoveries?
So birds are very similar to humans in the sense that they hear and listen and watch and observe visually. And those are the two senses that humans use most of the time. Birds can smell just like humans can. They can actually see better colors than we do. They have ultraviolet vision. But sound and vision are the two sensory communication methods that birds use. And so we people think that we can understand them. And I think that's why a lot of people sort of have a shared feeling with the birds, because they're colorful and they're melodious. It turns out that the birds world is very different from that. And so my work has been to try to understand in what ways are birds actually different from us. But the other aspect of the birds that's really interesting to humans, and I was just reviewing a book on the social lives of birds, is that most of them are just like humans. They raise their children as biparental units. There's a mom, there's a dad, but there's of course a lot of differences. There's group living, there's helps by the grandparents or by the grandchildren. So their social lives is also similar to humans. And again, I think we have this shared feeling about how to go about the world, whether you're a human or a bird.
And of course, if you're interested in birds, you also have to be interested in eggs. And I know that your last book is a book on birds, but that a previous book was a book on eggs. What was so fascinating about eggs that you felt that you absolutely needed to sort of have this entire book dedicated to them?
Well, it was a wonderful invitation by the University of Chicago Press. They knew that I had been working on eggs and egg colors, and even though I was based in a psychology department at Hunter College, I used to travel to the 9th floor and use a chemical laboratory to study the pigments that make up egg colors. So, you know, I'm a biologist by training, but there I was in a comparative psychology department using chemistry tools. And so I became an expert in bird egg coloration. And the nice thing about eggs is they don't move. You know, they stay put. When you find them, you can predict where they are going to be. I mean, some of them do move, you know, and that's interesting as well. But most bird eggs stay in the nest until they hatch. And so it's a good scientific subject for study.
You made reference there about your time as a faculty member at Hunter. So you completed your training at Cornell, and then you ended up joining the CUNY family. And I know that when you were part of the faculty at Hunter, you won a very, very prestigious recognition. It's the Human Frontier Science Award, right? And it's a very competitive and only a very small number of individuals. Can you tell us about what made you get the award? I mean, what was the discoveries or the work that led to that recognition? And if you can say whether that was something that was a game changer in your career or not.
Absolutely. So this award, you know, has a 4% funding rate. So, you know, the nice thing about it is that most of the people just have to write a 1,500-word pre-application, and then when you do get to be invited for the full application, you have a 30% chance of being funded. And what we did uniquely was this combination of animal behavior, chemistry, the perception of the bird's world, and also at that time, the president of the society, the Human Frontier Science Program, was Thorsten Wiesel, who used to be the president of Rockefeller University and got the Nobel Prize for visual research. And I think he liked our project that we're trying to understand how chemistry and bird vision interact with each other. The question being, if you're a cuckoo, a European cuckoo, and lay your egg in somebody else's nest, you have to make sure that that egg doesn't get rejected. And so you lay a mimetic egg. Through evolution, you have adapted to laying an egg that looks just like the host, like a warbler or a sparrow. And so we wanted to understand the chemical basis of that mimicry. And so I worked with Mandy Holford and other people at the chemistry department at Hunter to be able to understand the chemical basis of this visual trickery. And I think, you know, by building an international team from the Czech Republic, from New Zealand, where I had been before Hunter, we were able to convince the reviewers that this was a good project. And getting $1 million, you know, to study bird behavior and bird vision goes a long ways. You know, we traveled widely around the world looking at bird eggs. I bought a 3D printer, you know, that printed the 3D printed eggs. We painted them different colors, and so I was able to support my students, my research, and at the same time being able to afford time to write a book such as the Book of Eggs.
That's excellent. And you mentioned Mandy Holford, who is an incredible colleague and a product of the City University of New York. I graduated from York, and she was one of the keynote speakers at the 10th anniversary event.
Indeed.
And really a great story, and a phenomenal fellow scientist.
Yes.
So let me then pivot, because one of the things that I have enjoyed in listening to you today, but also doing a little research right before we interview you, is that your research is incredibly interdisciplinary. If people notice in your answers, you talked about biology, you talk about chemistry, you talk about coloration. I mean, you talked about a whole number of different disciplines and fields that came together to be part of the research that you were conducting, right? Which I know is part of your DNA as a researcher, which is a perfect fit for the role that you have now as the executive director of our Advanced Science Research Center. So let me allow you first, for folks who are not familiar with the ASRC, can you tell us a little bit about what is it, what does it do, its history, and some of the very important projects that it's conducting at this time?
So the Advanced Science Research Center is really a CUNY science experiment. What kind of research can we produce? How can we help people with the science that we produce? And how can we mentor and train and outreach to the community that we're situated in? So it's a modern building. It's a 10-year-old building on the City College campus in West Harlem. And it's structured into 5 different disciplines. Nanoscience, and it turns out that bird eggs have nanostructure. So I lectured about bird eggs in the nanoscience initiative at the SRC before I got the job there. We have photonics, which is a field of optics and physics that is important for telecommunication, but also defense purposes. We've got a neuroscience initiative that works on circadian rhythms, glial cells, and human diseases and the cures for those diseases. We've got an environmental sciences division that looks at water management, but also urban trees. Most recently, I think one of our researchers was in the New York Times twice in 2 weeks because he studies urban trees and the way they cope with living in an environment like that. And we have structural biology, which makes sense because the Structural Biology Center is on the City College campus about 2 buildings away. And so we are able to attract the best and the brightest in each of these fields to be able to conduct world-class science. What I mean by world-class science is impact. Nature, science, proceedings of the National Academy of the USA papers are almost commonplace in this building. In my career, I had 3 of those papers. Since I've been at the SRC, we've published about 12 of those. As a building itself. In fact, I have to remind people that when they get a Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences USA paper, they should send me a special email because it's a great accomplishment, and we want to make sure that the public knows that CUNY researchers are producing at this level of impact.
You mentioned that it is physically located as part of the City College campus in Harlem, but it is technically affiliated to the Graduate Center, although the faculty there, many belong to the Graduate Center, but they also belong to some of the other CUNY campuses, Hunter, City College, Queens, Brooklyn College, and many others. So it's a really fantastic hub of innovation and also a site of partnership with many other local New York City and area universities and industries too, right?
Absolutely. We have 17 core facilities in the building, and those core facilities serve a third the building itself, a third all the other CUNY campuses, and a third other universities within the greater New York City ecosystem. We've got New York City's cleanest and largest nanofabrication facility, and it's so good, and it's sitting on bedrock of West Harlem on top of the hill, that even Columbia University has co-located some of their instruments because our place is safer and cleaner than their facility. But we work with everybody throughout the CUNY system. We work with community colleges, we work with City Tech, and we work with the flagship colleges as well. And we work with people as far as Brookhaven National Lab and the other resources that are great collaborators for us, both governmental agencies, private universities, and we serve the industry. We serve startup companies because we can prototype their designs, and then they can try out their ideas and then sell themselves to pharma or other sources. It's actually hard to work with startup companies because they don't stay around for too long. But that's the success, right? When they go and become part of a larger organization or they grow themselves, that means they are successful, and then they build their own labs or use somebody else's.
But even startups who do not succeed, I mean, that's one of the sides of science that people often do not appreciate, that you all read about the fantastic discovery, you read about the great successes, right? But in able to get there, there was a large number of failures, a large number of things that didn't work up. And that happens with startups, and many of them fail. But in that failure, there's a number of key lessons learned, and they help to advance the field. And it is, I think, one of the most exciting spaces at CUNY because of that interdisciplinarity, because of that coming together of multiple institutions. And it's the environment in which I think scientists do best, right? Because they are challenged by individuals who are bringing questions or perspectives not from their field. It's all happening there. One of the things that you provide is the best equipment. So if you're a researcher too, you have to worry less about being able to purchase all those things that are costly, and then you can use your money for other things in the lab. One of the other things, and I know this is a really, really important thing to you, right, is that in that community, which as you said is very diverse, the mentoring of the next generation of scientists is really, really important. And I know that scientists are always very proud of the students that work in their labs, the students that are part of their PhD committees. Can you give me a little bit of a sense of how this mentoring works at the SRC?
Yeah, so what happens is, you end up in a lab that's really a world-class leader in the field. And so it's an everyday event for us to host people both from the city, the state, but also across the country and different continents. And so you get to be exposed to sabbatical scholars. You get to be exposed to other floors in our seminars and our social networking events. And so you become part of this community that both generates and also challenges you. And so you want to rise to the level of the science and the extent of the expertise that your mentors have, and vice versa. As a mentor, you dedicate your time to training the students, to making sure that they succeed themselves. And most of the science gets done by graduate students and postdocs. And so you look at who was the first author on an article and who is the last author, and that's everybody else is part of the team, but those are the true leaders and conceptualizers of the science itself. And so, it's much more important and successful for a faculty member to get a student as a first author on a paper than, to have themselves as a first author on the paper. And I think the ASRC really lives by this example. We have large and productive labs, well-funded labs from extramural agencies, DOD, NSF, NIH, other resources, private foundations. And that also allows the students to flourish, to ask questions that are not necessarily guaranteed to have an answer, but they can afford that extra 6 months, that extra year of wondering, whether this idea will reach a plausible solution in their science.
And doing that in a community of the scientists and fellow graduate students who are in a similar situation. And I think so many of us who've been in academia think that one of the best times is precisely that unstructured time in which you are discussing ideas with colleagues, and then sometimes that's where the eureka moment comes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so my job is both to champion the causes of the students and their mentors, but also provide opportunities for this intermingling, both across the different graduate programs of the Graduate Center. And so many of our events, I just send out messages to the executive officers of the different PhD programs and send your students. We're having a networking event. Or ask people from across the street or the Structural Biology Center to come over, and or Columbia for that matter. We are in the research triangle of Harlem itself, and so it's easy to walk to us. It's easy to come to us. In fact, I'm trying to convince the former dean of the medical school at Columbia, to have a stop of the medical shuttle between the main Columbia campus and the medical school, but she became the president of Columbia about 2 days after the talk.
Maybe she'll have more power now to actually get that shuttle stop and
exactly.
do that. And you were talking about great programs at the Graduate Center and many of our CUNY campuses. And I know there's a program very dear to your heart, which is a master's in animal behavior and conservation.
Yeah.
Can you give the audience a sense as to the students who go to that program, what are they studying and what are they excited about?
Absolutely. So this is a psychology department-based master's program. It's a freestanding program in animal behavior and conservation, and I got hired to it in 2007, and I joined Hunter at 2009. It's a program for students to work on behavior, but also on species that are either endangered or in some sort of conservation trouble, whether it's due to global change, whether it's due to urbanization, invasive species, that have moved across barriers. And so, this is a psychology-informed program in the sense that we care about cognition and behavior and the conservation of those traits. People don't realize that animals also have culture. They have dialects, they have cultural traditions, they pass behaviors onto their progeny. And so conserving those aspects of animal life is also as important as conserving DNA or conserving numbers. And so this is what the program does. And so graduates include, animal behavior researchers who work on brood parasitic cowbirds like my students, but they also include Isabella Rossellini, who, wrote a play as part of her master's thesis and performs it. It's called Darwin's Smile, and she uses principles she learned as part of this program in her artistic interpretation of animal life.
You've been focused on birds. So do we have, I should know this, is there what is the ASRC official bird?
We don't have one, but I think...
I think that we should begin some kind of process to determine that.
Absolutely, absolutely. We are on top of a hill, so, there are definitely hawks coming by, but we're also the home of a lot of robins in our little courtyard. And now that the leaves have fallen, I find all the old nests from last breeding season, and we're very good at it. So I think the robins do like the ASRC.
Okay, perfect. So with that, we'll take a quick break. When we return, we'll be fielding questions from students, so please stay with us. My guest today is Dr. Mark Hauber, esteemed professor of animal behavior and the executive director of CUNY's Advanced Science Research Center. Our conversation today is about how the ASRC is driving scientific discovery and how it's preparing the next generation of researchers. Now, let's hear from two PhD students who've been inspired by Mark's research.
Hi, my name is Denise Moran Ramirez, and I'm a second-year developmental neurobiology PhD student. And my question for Dr. Hauber is, how can researchers make their work more accessible and engaging to the general public during a time where science is increasingly undermined?
Great question.
Excellent question. Scientists tend to publish in peer-reviewed journals, which, if you're lucky, gets cited once. If you're lucky, gets read by 5 people. And so it's our absolute obligation to translate the meaning of our science to the public in general, so that they can be informed, whether it's the parents of the students that we're teaching, whether it's communities that are not typically exposed to science. National Science Foundation requires that we do broader impact statements where we reach out to communities that are typically underrepresented in the sciences or not at all represented. My favorite example is actually from the New York City Bird Alliance outreach program, where they went after sport fisher people and temple and church-going communities to tell them about the role of migratory birds in local ecosystems. And I've always been inspired by that. But I, in my own work, try to publish books, talk to journalists, and I advocate for that. Anytime I see a paper coming out in a high-impact journal at the SRC, I ask our communications team to represent it. We've grown our communication team with science writers, and so we do press releases and social media on behalf of the scientists as well.
Yeah. And I think the general public thoroughly enjoys when they can find someone that has the intellectual rigor and the knowledge and can find a way to convey that in a way that any lay person can correct. And that's also a great way to demystify science and bring more students to be able to think about them as future scientists and researchers. So
yeah, at the SRC we do this by doing field trips for middle schoolers and high schoolers. We've had over 2,500 students visit the space that was designed within the SRC, the Illumination Hub, for this kind of outreach. And so at the 10th anniversary, we highlighted some of the graduates of those field trips that have become PhD students either at CUNY or at Johns Hopkins. And we don't really care where those students end up as long as, you know, a few of them become scientists, a few of them become advocates. And one thing I really enjoy about the SRC is the amount of undergraduate and researchers who come and stay with us in the summer. And even if they become doctors, I'd rather have a science-trained and research-experienced doctor or anthropology professor than somebody who hasn't had those kind of experiences in the labs.
Excellent. So let's go to the second student question. Catherine?
Hi, my name is Catherine Anderson, and I'm a sixth-year PhD student in molecular neuroethology. My question for Dr. Hauber is, does the ASRC have any specific strategies for retaining students from historically excluded populations in STEM? And how do these strategies evolve across career stages, from students to postdocs to early career faculty?
Another great question.
That's a fantastic question. We do lose diversity when you go from the undergraduate population to the graduate population. And so we have some strategies, top-up scholarships available for underrepresented groups as defined by the National Science Foundation within the building itself. We dedicate some of our resources to support and to nurture the kind of diversity that the Graduate Center is able to bring in. And retention of the students who have already dedicated their first year or second year at the SRC is paramount. We don't want to have people drop out because of financial resources or other aspects. And so, you know, I think by providing the milieu, but also the support, the grant funding for the lab and for the student stipends, those are all strategies that help us to retain the diversity.
Well, and it's an amazing example of for people to see that, you know, world-class science is being performed here, right here in Harlem. You don't have to go to ivory tower places to be able to do that. And I think we got a little bit of the glimpse of the diversity. And those are your students, right?
Those are students who work in the disciplines that I'm familiar with. Yeah.
But you could also tell that they also come from diverse backgrounds.
Absolutely.
And I know it's a very, very top concern in terms of the recruitment of the faculty and then in building the next generation of scholars. And we all have work to do in that space, but clearly CUNY and the Graduate Center are by far ahead in the sciences in that field. So
absolutely. And the medical school, the CUNY Medical School just received an almost $20 million NIH grant for research centers of minority institutions. And you know, that's a CUNY tradition. Hunter and City College had those grants. Now the medical school has it. And it brings in both faculty who serve as role models, but also supports the students, you know, who are in those labs and makes the faculty successful as mentors.
Mark, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing some of the great work that is being done at the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center and as a leader at the ASRC. So great to have you here. And to our viewers, thank you again for joining us. Catch Café con Felo every weekend, airing Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. here on CUNY TV. Saludos.